Welcome to another Actualized episode, and in this one, we're going to be talking about the many facets of awakening, otherwise known as enlightenment. This is an advanced episode for serious students of Non Duality. I'm going to be telling you over 30 facets of awakening that I have personally verified, and that I claim you can verify for yourself as well in your spiritual journey. These are some of the deepest insights that a human being can have about the nature of reality and life. These are absolute insights beyond the realm of science, logic, culture, and human knowledge. This is as deep as it gets, and I'm going to be giving you a whole list of these so you can check them off as you're doing this work. But before we get into that, let me just quickly remind you, Actualized.org did just launch on Patreon, which is a platform for supporting independent creators. Many of you have contributed, and I'm very grateful and thankful for that. If you would like to contribute and support my work, then you can go to patreon.com/actualized or click the link down below that you'll find below the video and make a small monthly contribution. That helps me to improve the quality of my content and my work and to stay independent and to expand into new domains in the future. All right, so with that said, let's get into it. So one of the biggest misconceptions about enlightenment or awakening is that it's just a single realization. You have it, boom, it's some binary switch that you flip from off to on, and now you're awake, you're enlightened, that's it, done. And that's sort of the simplistic newbie notion of what awakening is like. Well, it's not really like that. It's far more complicated than that. There are facets to it. There are facets and there are degrees. And so that's what we'll be talking about, mostly the facets here. You can be conscious of one of these facets, but yet clueless about the others. That's the interesting and tricky thing about this work. So you always have to be careful. Just because you've glimpsed one of these things, one of these facets, doesn't mean that you understand everything there is to understand. You might be missing something very important. So sometimes we use the metaphor of thinking of awakening like this mountain, or we think of spiritual work as a mountain that you're climbing, and we say that, well, of course, there's different paths up the mountain, but all paths ultimately lead to the same peak. And this is a nice, cute little metaphor, and it seems like it should make sense. But what I've found is that actually it's more useful to think of awakening as a mountain range and not a single mountain, which means that not only are there multiple paths up the same mountain, but there's multiple mountains. And some mountains are higher than other mountains. And even though these different peaks share things in common, they're still different. And it does matter which peaks you're climbing and which path you're taking. And not all paths will take you up to the same peak. So that's a little additional wrinkle to spiritual work. So what is the value of this list that I'm about to give you? Why am I giving it to you? So that you can systematically pursue, and literally if you want, you can use this as a checklist to track your progress in this work. And the other great value here is that when you have this checklist, it's harder for you to fool yourself so that you don't miss any of them. Because sometimes what happens is people climb 1 or 2 peaks and they think that they're done, when actually there's 10 more peaks that they've missed. That's what I tend to find. So that's the value of this list. So let's get right into it. What are all these different facets? Well, in no particular order, I will be listing them to you. Of course, you can experience them in different orders. You're not going to necessarily, it's not going to happen in the same order that I'm listing them, of course. So the first one is, what is Samadhi? To know what Samadhi means. Or in other words, to know what a mystical experience is, or to enter a non-dual state. That's one of the first realizations usually that you have in this work, is that you have your first Samadhi experience, your first mystical experience. Now, of course, some teachers and people say, well, Leo, that's not enlightenment per se and all that. That's fine, but it's a critical step in this process, understanding what Samadhi is. What is Samadhi? Basically what it is it's a state of consciousness in which the duality between subject and object has been erased, where you realize that subject and object are one. And that's your first mystical experience, and that's your clue that there's something deeper going on within reality than you thought under the materialist paradigm. And this is your first sort of glimpse into mysticism or spirituality, where you realize oh shit, spirituality is not just beliefs and ideologies and crazy religious people believing hocus pocus. There's actually something serious and real here that I need to pursue further. Another facet, a very important one, is what I call the facet of no self. Buddhists also call it this, wherein you realize that there never was such a thing as a self. And what do we mean by a self? That human self that I'm pointing at right now, that I'm pointing to you, that thing that you think you are, that you have believed you are the whole of your life, this biological entity, this creature, this human, this mammal that you think you are, who was born and is living on this round rock that is orbiting the sun, all of this kind of personal story that you have of yourself. So when you truly awaken, you realize there never was such a self, that this self was imaginary. And that's a huge epiphany. That gets us a little bit more to the center of what awakening really means. And that's a very distinct insight that you can have. You can have a mystical experience, you can have a samadhi, but still the insight that there never was a self doesn't hit you. Or if it does, then it does. See, so all these facets that I'm going to be explaining here, you can experience them individually, or sometimes you can experience them in aggregate, lumped in with other facets. It all depends. So you can have a samadhi where you also realize that there never was a self. Or you can just have a samadhi. Or later you can just have an insight into no self. Or anything that I'm going to be mentioning on this list. The next facet is the facet that I'm going to call I am. Capital I am, all capital letters. I am. Just simply that I am, that you are. That is the deepest truth of what you are, is that I am. Or we might call it the self with a capital S. So you might wonder, well, doesn't this contradict the previous insight where I supposedly realized that I'm just imaginary? No, it's just two sides of the same coin. So when you realize no self, what you're realizing is that that human self that you thought was born, the thing that we use your name to refer to. So if I refer to you as John, or if I refer to you as Mary, and that's your given birth name, that's who you think you are, that identity. You realize that that whole thing is a fiction, and it never existed. But then the next question arises of well, what am I then? If I'm not that, then what am I? And the answer is, well, you're not a human, you're not even a thing, you're not even a physical object, you're just pure I amness, or the self with a capital S, the universal self. And this is, of course, what the various Hindu and yogi traditions refer to as the Atman, the royal self, the God self, the universal self, the I am. It's just an overwhelming feeling of I am. When you have this insight, it's like, I am. Oh, I realize that I am. Now, when you're listening to me say this, you might say, well, Leo, of course I am. That's so obvious. I am. Yeah, I already know that. Everybody knows that. No, you don't know that. You think you know that. The problem is right now, yes, you think you are, but you just think it. There's a big difference between thinking that you are and realizing that you're I amness itself. And more specifically, what you think you are right now is you think you are a human. That's your I am. That's not the true I am. That's a false I am. The true I am is without humanness. It's not limited to being a human or a creature or being physical or material or anything like that. It's just literally pure I amness. So, of course, it's here right now. You am right now, but you're not conscious of it the way you will be when you really awaken to it. This can also feel like you become conscious that you are the entire universe. So your identity expands from being a limited human self to being the whole universe. Literally, you experience this awakening as though the entire universe is looking through your eyes. And that's what was always the case, is that you have confused, the universe, in a sense, has confused itself for being a human. That's that facet. The next facet is what I call omnipresence. It's the realization that what you are, pure I amness, is completely omnipresent, which means that it's not located. It's not located behind the eyes, between the ears, in your skull, in your head. It's not in the brain. It's not here. It's not there. It's not in your chest. It's not in your heart. It's not in your body. It's completely omnipresent. It's absolutely everywhere and simultaneously nowhere. That's omnipresence. That's you realizing the omnipresence of God, or the omnipresence of consciousness, or the omnipresence of I amness, your true self. That can be a freaky realization, because usually when we talk about objects or things, we think of them as being located or centralized. It's very counterintuitive and illogical for a thing to be omnipresent. And yet that's exactly what you are. And that's exactly what consciousness is. It's an omnipresent field, which is not located anywhere more than anywhere else. It's everywhere. And it's nowhere. The next facet is the answer to the question of what is consciousness, where you realize what consciousness is. So right now you're conscious, but you're not conscious of what consciousness is. In fact, you've been conscious your whole life, but you still aren't any closer to realizing what consciousness is. But if you do this work long enough and you have a deep awakening, you can get an answer to that question. And what is consciousness? Well, it's not a verbal answer. All these verbal answers that I'm giving you, they don't do justice to what we're really talking about. This requires a direct experience. This requires an awakening. It requires a shift in your consciousness. But for the first time in your life, you realize the significance of what consciousness is, and you realize that consciousness is absolutely everything. There is nothing but consciousness. There is nothing outside of consciousness. And usually, while you're realizing this, there's sort of an ancillary facet here that you realize, which is that there is no external physical reality. There is only consciousness. And there can be nothing outside of consciousness. And even the idea that there ever could have been an external reality seems ludicrous at this point, because you're so conscious, you realize that there can't be anything but consciousness. Another facet is the answer to the question of what is awakening. We use this word awakening, and many people talk about being woke. This is sort of becoming a popular term in pop culture, like, oh, that guy's woke, or he's woke, she's woke, blah, 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 blah. People who talk about being woke have no idea about what awakening really is. the only way to know what awakening is to actually awaken. And it's a distinct experience that you have. You awaken. Literally what happens is that you awaken from the dream of life. When you awaken, truly, you realize that your entire life has been just a dream. Exactly like a dream. Exactly like waking up from a nightmare. That's exactly what it's like. You awaken from that, and you look upon yourself, you look upon your body, you look upon the room you're in, and it's like looking at it for the first time. You're truly awake for the first time in your life. You're conscious of what everything is in a way that was totally impossible just a moment previously. And you understand for the first time what that word awakening really means. And the only way you can understand that is by doing it, by actually awakening. But what you'll be amazed to discover is that that word, awakening, is very accurate. You're going to be using that word. I remember the first time that I awoke, the first words that came to my mouth and to my mind is just that, like, oh my God, I'm awake. This is what it means to be awake. Like, this is really awake. Like, it's so awake that it's a level of wokeness that just shatters all of physical reality. It's miraculous. It's magical. It's incredible. You would think it's impossible to be this conscious. And yet, here it is. You're that conscious and you're finally awake for the first time in your life. That's an amazing experience, and that's what we might call a classic enlightenment or a satori. The next insight or facet is oneness or non-duality, where you really realize for the first time that everything is truly one. Before, you've probably heard about yogis and sages, and maybe myself, talking about oneness, how everything is one and all dualities collapse into one, blah, 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 blah. You've heard it a million times. You've read it a bunch of times in books and so forth, but you still don't understand what oneness really means. You might think oneness is a metaphor and so forth, but here you awaken to oneness and you realize, like, oh, it's truly one. It's absolutely one. Reality is one complete singular unit or thing with no boundaries in between anything. All objects and things are completely connected in a unified field of consciousness. That's what you realize. And this has many ramifications and consequences that I've talked about in the past, and I'll talk about more in the future. But this is a radical realization of oneness. When you realize this oneness, you realize that you're literally one with everything, with all beings, with all objects, plants, trees, animals, stars, universes, galaxies, like all of it. All of it is one. And you realize how everything that you thought was separate isn't really separate. The separation was imaginary. The separation was a projection of your own mind. You finally understand what non-duality means, and you have something to contrast it against with duality. You also now understand what duality means, so there's a contrast now between the two. As an ancillary facet or insight here, you could also realize that there is no difference between anything. That basically the difference between a cat and a dog is purely imaginary. The difference is relative. The difference exists if you think it exists. The difference between a taco and a human only exists and is real as long as you believe it is, as long as you imagine that it is. That's a very freaky insight when you realize that all differences are totally relative. So that comes with realizing oneness and non-duality. Another powerful facet of awakening is the answer to the question of what is truth? Truth with a capital T. I have an episode about that called What is Truth, where I explain it in more detail, so I won't go into it too much here. But basically, you realize that truth is the only thing there is. Truth and consciousness are one. Truth is absolutely everything. All perception and experience that you used to think was perception and experience, all of that gets recontextualized as absolute truth. And for the first time in your life, you understand what truth really means. Not truth as a conceptual idea or a belief, but truth with a capital T, like that which is actually true. What is that? Well, you have to awaken to what is truth. I can't tell you, and words will never do it justice. The next facet is, what is the absolute? To realize that. See, the only way it's possible to know what the absolute is to awaken to the absolute. Ordinary people, 99.999% of humans, have no reference for the word absolute. They could use that word, but they don't actually know what an absolute is. They only know relative things. Everything you know as an ordinary human being is relative stuff. All truths that you know are relative truths. But here you can awaken to something that's absolute. What that means is that it's true in the ultimate sense. It's true under all conditions. That means it's true even if the entire universe is destroyed. It's still true. What might that be? Well, you have to awaken to what is the absolute. You can't know it otherwise. Another facet here is absolute infinity. This is when you realize that consciousness is infinite. And this is where you realize for the first time what infinity is. Infinity is not a number. Infinity is also not a large size. So when I say infinity, you might think, well, that means that like maybe the universe goes infinitely far in all directions, like up and down and left and right, back and forward. That's not what infinity means. When I'm talking about infinity, I mean actual infinity. What is infinity? You don't know. But there's a distinct insight you can have into like, oh, absolute infinity. Everything is absolute infinity. You realize that everything that's happening and has ever happened is the manifestation of absolute infinity. What's happening right now is absolute infinity, but you're not conscious of that. That's a very powerful insight. Life transforming right there. You realize that you can zoom in and out of consciousness forever. It's completely endless. There's no end to it. Another facet that's closely related to this one is the realization of absolute nothingness. This is just the other side of the coin, where you realize that what is all of this that's here right now? It's absolutely nothing. What is consciousness? It's absolutely nothing. What is I amness? What am I? What is my true nature? What is everything made out of? Absolutely nothing. That's what all this is. Absolutely nothing. Never, nothing has ever happened. You think things have happened, but nothing has ever happened. Everything that has happened has just been nothing, which is identical to infinity. Nothingness and infinity are identical. And that's another thing you'll realize here. Maybe first you'll realize absolute infinity, but not yet nothingness. Then at another occasion, you can realize the facet of nothingness, but not infinity. And then on another occasion, you can merge the two together and realize that, oh, nothingness and infinity are literally identical. And then you have a more complete understanding, a more complete awakening. So this is closely related to the facet of answering the question of why is there something rather than nothing? You can answer that question for yourself. And you will answer it when you realize that everything is infinity and everything is absolute nothingness and that the two are identical. And when you realize that, you'll realize that, oh, why is there something? Because something literally is nothing and that the two can't be distinguished from each other because all distinctions are relative. And in the absolute sense, there are no distinctions, which means that everything is totally one. That's a powerful realization that basically explains to you the origin of all of reality. I'm talking about these things as though they're little insights that you have. No, these are gargantuan insights. When you're hit by one of these insights, it floors you. It knocks you to the ground. Like it baffles you. It leaves you speechless. It leaves you reeling. It leaves you crying. It leaves you shocked and paralyzed and terrified. Of course, your reactions to these insights will vary depending on how you feel, what you're doing, how developed you are, and so forth. The next insight, or facet, is the answer to the question of what is God. It's the direct encounter of God. You realize that God actually exists and that God is real. And you realize for the first time what the word God is pointing to. Everybody knows the word God, even atheists and scientific people. But 99.999% of people who use that word have no idea what it really refers to. They think it refers to some idea, some belief, some imaginary being in the sky, whatever. But you've never actually become conscious of what God is until this moment when you become conscious. You can also become conscious of what I call the Godhead, or what people call the Godhead. It's not just my word. Where you become conscious of the very crux, the very essence of God. And then there's yet another facet here related to God, which is where you become conscious that you are God. And you might think that these two are the same. Like, well, Leo, if I know that God exists, and if I know what God is, and I know the Godhead, that means that I know that I'm God automatically. No, not necessarily. You can have an encounter with God, but still not realize that God is you. That's a very important realization that many people miss when they're doing this work. You are God. Literally. That means that you are the creator of all of reality and the entire universe. That means that you have all the properties that are traditionally given to God. By the way, I have a two-part series called What is God? Part 1 and Part 2 that explains a lot more of this in depth if you're confused. So I won't go into that here, but yeah, you basically take back your full authority and your full power as God. You stop denying that you're God the way that most people do, and you realize that you are God sitting here right now, and that you have put yourself into this very position that you're in right now by willing it into being, because you have the power of infinite mind to imagine anything. And we'll get to that as another facet in a moment. So that's a very important realization. To me, you're not fully awake unless A, you realize and have a direct experience of God, and B, you realize and acknowledge that you are God. If you are denying that you're God, you're not fully awake. If you're denying that God exists, you're also not fully awake. That's a very, very distinct insight and realization. And it can take you multiple awakenings to reach that far. You may not realize on your first awakening that you are God, or what God is. For that, you have to go really deep. The next facet is that self equals other, and that other equals self, which is the collapse of the boundary between yourself and other sentient beings or creatures or humans. in this realization, you realize that all others that you have thought as being real beings, people, creatures, and so forth, you realize that all of them are just partitions of your own consciousness, that all others are imaginary, including your parents. And that actually, and this is another sub-facet here, is that you realize that you, as God, are all alone. That's one of the consequences of oneness, one of the consequences of non-duality. When all dualities collapse, that very critical duality of you versus other beings also must collapse. And at that point, you are totally one, totally alone. And this can be an especially shocking and jarring epiphany. Because up to this point, you might have had some mystical experiences and awakenings, and maybe you even realize you're God and all this, and it feels wonderful and nice and all that. But then to really come face to face with the realization that there are no other beings but yourself. This, I don't know how it is for others, but if you're like me, this was one of the insights that perhaps was most difficult for me to swallow. It's very shocking. It almost feels like you're losing your mind and that you're going insane, because you want to be able to be comforted by others. You want to be able to like reach out to somebody and ask them like, hey, is what I just experienced real, or am I fooling myself? But the problem is that when you realize that there is no other, and that other is just a projection of your own mind, you realize you can't reach out to other, because by reaching out to other, you're just reaching out to yourself. At this point, you also realize that, for example, whenever you're talking to others, you're always just talking to yourself. When you're hating others, you're just hating yourself. When you're having sex with others, you're just masturbating. You're having sex with yourself. It's impossible to have sex with somebody else. You're always masturbating. It's impossible to truly hate somebody else. You're always only hating yourself. It's impossible to harm somebody else. You're always only harming yourself. But for that, you have to realize that yourself includes all others. You see. Another facet is the answer to the question of what is love? When you become conscious for the first time of the love of God, absolute love, infinite love. This is also a very emotional insight for people. It's shocking. It's utterly baffling, because under the materialist paradigm, the way science has taught us, it's taught us that the universe is indifferent. Nature doesn't care about you. It's cold, heartless, and brutal, and it doesn't feel emotions. It's just some dumb, brute, physical object. But here, in your love awakening, you awaken to the fact that consciousness is love. Love is not an emotion. It's not some sappy, romantic feeling. It's not some wishful thinking, some new age philosophy. Love is the very substance of consciousness that everything is made out of. And that's a shocking realization, because you realize that all the evil and hatred and violence and murder and rape and incest and God knows whatever other horrific things you could imagine, torture and war and genocide and racism and theft and corruption and all manner of evil, that all of that is actually a manifestation of love. And that can be a very shocking awakening that you can deny and resist. Your mind and ego can resist it, because you spent most of your life hating people, judging people, criticizing people, fighting evil. And then you realize that all of that was actually love. That's a bitter pill to swallow for the ego. A sub-facet of this realization is the realization that truth and love are absolutely identical. You can have that realization. I remember when I realized that, I was looking at my hand, and I realized that my hand is literally made out of love. And I realized that truth and love are totally identical. And it was such a beautiful insight. It was like, you might say, the cherry on top of my sundae. Of all these different awakenings that I've had, to finally realize and to put the two together, that truth and love are just two sides of the same coin and that they're absolutely identical. That was an amazing, amazing insight. And I think that a lot of people miss this one, even if they have other sorts of awakenings. Another facet that you can realize is that everything is absolutely imaginary. Or, as I otherwise call it, infinite mind. When you realize that the only thing that's real is the mind. Mind with a capital M. Infinite mind. That's what reality is. When you see a car, a tree, a human, a star, a planet, some clouds, whatever you're doing, all of that is just infinite mind. It's the work of a cosmic mind that is imagining all of this. The entire universe is happening within the mind of God, which is, of course, your own mind. Not some other mind, but your own mind. And this very moment that is here right now, me talking, this is just me hallucinating all of physical reality. Everything is imaginary. Your past, your future, other people, your dog, your memories of childhood, the difference between a human and a taco, the difference between a cat and a dog, all of it is imaginary. It is that way you imagine it to be, but only as long as you're imagining it that way. Another way of saying it is that reality is a dream. Or another way of saying it is that reality is a hallucination. Everything is a hallucination. You're constantly hallucinating. If you're not hallucinating, you're dead. Life is hallucination, and death is the end of hallucination, in a sense. We'll get to the death question here in a moment. That's a separate facet, but for now, let's focus on everything is imaginary. That's a very epic epiphany. See, you can have various kinds of awakenings, but still not fully grasp that, like, literally, absolutely everything that you think is real is completely imaginary, including the physical wall, the floor you're sitting on, the earth, the sky, the air you think you're breathing, your brain, your mind, science, religion, society, culture, your parents, DNA, atoms, molecules, cells, biology, chemistry, physics. Everything is absolutely imaginary. That's quite a mindfuck. Quite difficult to accept that. But a very crucial insight, of course, because this allows you to understand how all of reality gets created and what it really is. The next facet is what I call self-design, the realization of self-design. And this is a really twisted, strange, loopy, mind-fucky realization where you realize that you are creating yourself. For example, when I realized this, I've realized this multiple times, but the first time I realized it, I realized that every hair right here on my arm that I see, every single hair, it was as though I planted each one on my arm when I was designing my own body using infinite mind. See, that's how God did it. Literally, the kind of attention to detail that, you know, those some of those old retired people that sit there and they build that model sail ship inside of a bottle sort of thing, you know, very carefully. They spend a year painstaking little tweezers, putting together like every little rope on that sail ship and every little plank of wood. They put it in there and they glue it all together and they paint every little, you know, screw and nail on this little model that they're building with such attention to detail and love and such precision. And then, finally they put it up on their shelf and it's this beautiful creation. Well, that same attention to detail you put into creating and designing the entire universe. And of course, your own body. So what you realize is that the human body that's here it didn't somehow evolve randomly through random selection and mutation and all this, is that you designed it with infinite intelligence. You designed yourself. And that's really shocking to realize and to accept, because it seems so counterintuitive. It seems impossible. It seems like, well, how could I have designed myself? But you did. You just forgot that you did. The next facet is when you become conscious of how you were born, what your birth really is. And here, of course, you realize that you weren't born at all. You existed forever. Your birth as a human is totally imaginary. And so you realize that that story that you believed in your whole life, that you were born like you were a creature that crawled out of your mother's vagina, that whole story, you realize that that's just an imaginary story. It didn't actually happen that way. The way you were born is by imagining that you were born. That's how you were actually born. And that's very, very jarring and shocking to accept that, because you have to admit that all the stories of your birth were just stories. They weren't actually real. You've been alive forever. There was never a time where you did not exist. You've existed for more than 1 trillion years. Imagine 1 trillion, 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 trillion years of a being just sitting there in empty space, existing for trillions upon trillions upon trillions upon trillions of years. Before there was even a universe, before the Big Bang, there was a being that was sitting there just hanging out in empty space. Well, all of that is just less than 1% of how long you've actually existed. You've existed forever. It's pretty shocking. Which leads us to the next facet, which is the realization of eternity, or no time, or the absolute now. You realize for the first time what now really means. You realize that there is no past and there is no future, because they're both imaginary. They're both being imagined right now, in the now. Everything that's happening is right now, and the now is absolute and it's eternal. You realize what the word eternal means. Eternal means completely outside of time. It's as though time never existed. You realize that this moment right now is eternity. This moment right now, me talking here to you, you sitting there listening to me, this has been here and is here for eternity. It's completely eternal. This is not happening inside of time. Time is an illusion. Time is a projection of the human mind. And the human mind is just a projection of God's infinite mind. So even your body, it seems like your body grows old and it dies. No, your body is actually totally eternal. It exists forever, outside of time. Which leads us to the next facet, which is the realization and the answer to the question of, what is death? Or, in other words, the realization of immortality. Because time is just a projection of your own mind, it's just imaginary, because there is no past and no future other than in one's imagination, because everything is eternal, the now is eternal, now is what you are, now is I amness. You realize that what death is death is purely imaginary. There is no such thing as death. Death is impossible. you are totally immortal and eternal. As God, as nothingness, as infinity. You exist as all things at all times. It doesn't matter what form you exist in, because you are all forms. You incarnate as all beings. You are looking through the eyes of all beings. So, yes, you can kill this Leo body sitting here, but it won't matter. I'll just respawn as something else. You realize that God cannot die because God has nowhere to go. If you were to kill God or destroy God, where would God go? God is already nowhere and nothing. God is already at the place where God would be if you killed him, so to speak. And then you realize, what is death? Death is just a story that I've been telling myself. Death is a story the ego creates. It's always something you imagine. There is no death in the now, and the now is the only thing there is. Death is, as humans conceive of it, is always some future idea, literally purely imaginary. And you realize this on a visceral level, to the point where you are fully immortal. And at this point, usually comes the next facet of realization here, which is the realization of paradise or heaven or perfection. You realize that reality is absolute perfection. With the realization of immortality, you have no more fear because nothing bad can happen to you. You've literally transcended death. And so as an immortal, eternal being that you now realize that you are, you're in paradise. You're in heaven. You realize that heaven is right here, right now. Heaven is not some place you go to. Heaven is just the realization of eternity, of absolute love. Heaven and hell, you realize, are not physical locations. The only difference between heaven and hell is how much you're attached to your ego. The more you're attached to ego, the more you're in hell. And when your ego is completely surrendered and you realize that you're no self, that you're immortal, you're in heaven. And that doesn't depend on changing your physical location. It only depends upon your state of consciousness. How conscious are you of your own immortality? If you become conscious that you're immortal right now, you will automatically be in heaven. Which brings us to the next facet, which usually comes and accompanies this realization I was just talking about, which is the realization of bliss or ecstasy. People use this word ecstasy and bliss a lot. But again, this word rings hollow for most people, for 99.999%, because they don't have a reference experience for what ecstasy really is. Ecstasy is not just extreme pleasure. Ecstasy is the realization of immortality and the realization that everything is heaven. When you realize that, it's so good, it's infinitely good. It's not just good, it's good to the infinite degree. It's so much goodness that you can't contain it. Your body can't hold it. Your entire body shakes and shudders in a cosmic orgasm of bliss. It's perfection. It's total peace. It's absolute love. That's truly ecstasy. And very few humans have a reference experience for that word, ecstasy. But you can reach that. And then you'll know what the word ecstasy actually means. You'll know what I'm talking about. Some of you actually know what I'm talking about. Many of you don't. That's something to work on. The next facet you can realize is what I call infinite intelligence. You realize that consciousness is infinitely intelligent. You realize that the intelligence of human beings is just a tiny little infinitesimal part of infinite universal intelligence. This intelligence is baked into the physical substratum of reality. It's not just a matter of thinking intelligently or having a high IQ. These are all woefully inadequate definitions of intelligence. Here, for the first time, you realize what intelligence really is. Everything is intelligence. Consciousness is intelligence. That chair, that tree, that wall, that house, that human, your own body, everything that's happening is pure infinite intelligence. Intelligence, you realize, is not something your brain does. It's not being able to pass some sort of fancy IQ test. Intelligence is being. There's infinite intelligence in the cells that are making up my hand and my body. And you realize that. And for the first time, you see how intelligent the design of the universe is. You've never realized this before. Sure, you've marveled at beautiful photographs of animals and galaxies and nebulas and sunsets and this, and sometimes maybe you look at your body and you say, wow, look, my body is quite amazing. It's ingenious. Look at how everything works together, like my bones and my skin and my arteries, my veins, the heart pumping blood through my blood vessels, and how it all works, and how my hands, they have these different textures and fingerprints that can be used to grasp a glass of water and all this, and I can drink and I can eat and I can do all these amazing things, and I can think and I can create art and all of this, and I can design stuff, and humans design stuff, different phones and gadgets and computers and cars and electronics and all of this. But even if you understand all that, you still don't understand how deeply intelligent all of this is. It's not just intelligent, it's infinitely intelligent. You realize that all of this is the mind of God, and that it is responsible for creating this well-oiled machine that is reality. And for the first time, you realize, like, oh my God, it's so fucking intelligent. It's so perfect. It's so ingenious how all these different systems work together. You know, males and females, and relationships and communication and business and art and entertainment and sexuality and animals and the ecosystem and the environment and the solar system, you know, planets rotating around stars, and there's asteroids and comets and all of this. It's functioning like a well-oiled machine. And all the laws of nature, everything that science studies, the DNA in your cells and all of this, it all functions perfectly without a single hitch. You might say, oh, but Leo, there's like genetic mutations. Isn't that a mistake? How could you say reality is perfect when there's genetic mutations? You don't understand. The genetic mutations, that's part of the intelligence. It's so intelligent that your limited, finite human mind can't grasp the intelligence of it. You think you can design reality better than it is? You can't. You're just being a fool. And you'll only realize that when you awaken to infinite intelligence. Another facet you can realize is absolute goodness. Goodness with a capital G. You realize that there's nothing bad in the universe at all. That badness is purely a projection of your own selfishness. Once the selfishness is gone, only absolute goodness remains. You realize that everything is absolutely good, including everything you used to think was evil. You might say, well, Leo, isn't this the same insight as infinite love? And here it's a little tricky. It could be. You certainly could realize absolute goodness and infinite love in one fell swoop. But also I've had it where I've realized infinite love, but I still didn't quite realize absolute goodness. So there can also be a distinction, a subtle distinction there, which is why we call them facets. Facets of ultimately the same thing. Another thing you can realize as a facet is the answer to the question of what is will? Infinite will. Will with a capital W, you can realize. In this insight, what you realize is that absolutely everything that's created, that's happening right now, is happening through the will of God, through the will of this infinite mind, which means that when God wills something, because it's an infinite mind, it's an infinite intelligence, what happens is that that thing instantly materializes. Instantly. So my physical body, as it's sitting here right now, is the crystallization of the will of God right now. If God wasn't willing this body to do what it's doing and to say what it's saying and to move the hands as it's moving them, it wouldn't be happening. This is the will of the entire universe. Reality is willed into existence. It's not something that happens accidentally through some dumb brute force process, some mechanical means. It's actually amechanical. It's directly willed. And then what you realize is that your human will, what we call human free will, is just a tiny sliver of God's infinite will, of the will of the universe. And so the will that you use as a human to do your ordinary stuff, like to go to the gym, to lift weights, to get some work done, to answer an email, to go to the grocery store, this will that you use to meditate and so forth, that's a tiny sliver of God's will. So if we just expand that out to infinity, then you realize that you can use that, God can use that to create everything. And in fact, that is what you're doing. You're just not conscious of it yet. You also can become conscious here of a subfacet, which is unlimited power. Power with a capital P. Infinite will means infinite power. With infinite will, you can create absolutely anything. And here you become conscious that there is no limit upon God. God, or infinite mind, is totally unlimited, which means that it can create absolutely anything it wants. There's no limit to what it can create. So whatever physical limits you think there exist, if you think there exist logical limits to the universe, to reality, none of that is ultimately true. All of that is relative truth. Ultimately, God can do anything. Because if God is one, what is there outside of God that would limit God? Nothing. God even is the nothing. So how can God be limited? It can't, other than by its own will. So what God can do is God, for example, can create a human and can limit the human. In fact, a human is a limit. So in this sense, a human isn't all-powerful. A human doesn't have unlimited power. Because what a human is God imagining itself in a limited form. But the Godhead itself is pure unlimited power. The next facet is omniscience. This is a very distinct one where you can literally become totally omniscient. The mistake people make here is they think that omniscience means that you know everything. Like, if you ask me, what is the distance from the Earth to Jupiter? If I'm omniscient, I should be able to tell you instantly, right? No, that's not what omniscience really means. Omniscience is much deeper than that. Omniscience happens at the level of being, not at the level of conceptual knowledge. So you can be totally omniscient at the level of being, but still not know what your neighbor had for lunch this morning or this afternoon. Omniscience is an incredible experience, incredible, shocking experience. Personally, I experienced it much later, in my later awakenings, not in the early steps. But it's possible. Another facet is the realization of divinity, magic, and mystery. What you realize is that consciousness is divine. You don't know what the word divine is until you've deeply awoken. You don't know what magic is until you've deeply awoken. This human perception, all these colors and sounds and feelings that we're experiencing right now that make up reality for us. Usually we just think of this as human experience, but it's not just human experience. This is literally divinity right now, the light of consciousness that's shining forth and bringing all of this into our awareness as a human. This is divinity. It glows with divinity when you awaken. It's like you walk down the street and everything just glows at you. That's sort of how it feels, if I would have to describe it. And at the same time, there's a deep and profound mystery to everything. You look at everything and it seems so mysterious. And the reason it seems so mysterious is because there's a subfacet here where you realize not knowing. You realize that actually you don't know anything about being, because being is prior to knowing. And here there's also another subfacet where you realize that knowledge and being, really, they can collapse under non-duality and oneness. They can collapse together, and you realize that knowing is just literally another form of being. And so God doesn't know itself per se because it's prior to knowledge. God just is itself. It's being. Speaking of which, there can be another facet here of realizing what is being. By being, I'm just referring to everything that is. Everything is being. But what is being? Well, you have to awaken to that. Being, we might say, is the substance of reality. But what is that substance? What is the substance of reality? That's something you can awaken to. We might say it's being, or we might say that it's consciousness. Consciousness is the substance of reality. But what is consciousness? What is the substance of consciousness? Well, at this point, you can't go any further because consciousness is actually nothing. So here you need to realize that being literally is nothing, or its distinction, its differences. And what are differences? They're nothing. So you're not going to understand it just by me explaining it. You have to actually become deeply conscious of this to get it. But it's profound to get. Another facet that you can realize is that the universe is an infinite fractal. You can zoom into it and zoom out of it forever. And it's self-similar. This is why we call it a fractal. It's self-similar at the macro and micro levels. You can also realize the facet of what is perception. I have an episode about that, what is perception, which explains it. Human perception is recontextualized as being or truth. Another subfacet of this one is that you can realize that perception has infinite resolution. Consciousness has infinite resolution. Another facet you can realize is the answer to the question of what is life? What is life? What does it mean to be alive? You can realize that the entire universe is alive. It's not just your body that's alive, but that chair or that table or that wall or that house is not alive. All of it is alive. As incredible as that might seem. So this question that science is struggling to answer, which is, where did life come from? It didn't come from anywhere because everything is alive. It's just a question of what form does it take? The mind of God is alive, and then it can take different forms. It can take the form of a concrete block, of a brick, of a house, of a plane, of a train, of a human, of a dog, of a cat, of a tree, of whatever. And then whether it moves or not, breathes or not, has blood or not, these are distinctions, relative distinctions that you make as a human. The whole system is alive, we might say. Another facet you can realize is what is the purpose or point of existence? Why does it all exist? What is it all for? Why all this complexity? Why all this form? Why all this elaborate stuff? Why planets and stars are circling around each other? And why the earth? Why plants and animals? Why humans? Why societies? Why war? Why politics? Why everything? Why anything? Why? You can understand what the ultimate why is. And the ultimate why is love. It's all a manifestation of your love as God. So there you go. Those are the facets. That's the list. There's some bonus ones I want to give you as well. You can realize the facet that I will call channeling or communication with God. You can actually communicate with God, which is really nothing other than communicating with yourself, but you're communicating with your higher infinite self. You're communicating with infinite mind, which usually humans are not tapped into in their ordinary consciousness as they're going about life. So that's a interesting breakthrough you can have. You can actually get direct insights from God. You can talk to God, ask God questions. God can hear you and answer you in profound ways. So that's pretty cool to realize. Another bonus facet is healing. You can realize that it's possible to actually heal yourself because, of course, you're connected to the will of God and everything is just an infinite mind. So if you want, you can heal yourself and you can heal others. Actually, this can be useful and very beneficial to you and to others. Many mystics and sages in the past have claimed stories of miraculous healing, and you will realize why that is. You'll realize those weren't just stories and myths, but that it's actually possible, and you can actually go deeper into that and to realize how healing actually works. That's pretty amazing. Another bonus facet or feature that you could realize is collective consciousness. You can realize that consciousness is not just individual, but that there's layers to consciousness. It's like an onion, and there's many sort of a nested chain of various consciousnesses and hierarchies, and you can realize and think of, for example, the human collective consciousness or the collective consciousness of a different species, and you can tap into that. It's pretty cool. Another facet that you can realize is a total extinction of perception. The Buddhists talk about this. Advanced meditators talk about this, how literally you can sit there in meditation for so long that the entire universe just disappears. Everything just goes blank. Personally, I've not had that experience myself, but I'm pretty sure that's possible given how many people report that. Another facet is that there's various kinds of paranormal phenomena that you can tap into as you do meditation practice, and various other kinds of insights come to you. You can develop various paranormal abilities. There's like clairvoyance, there's telepathy, there's past life, tapping into your own past lives. I guess channeling is also considered a paranormal activity. Sort of hyper intuition about the future, this sort of stuff. And finally, you can tap into the facet of alien entities, other entities which are non-human. And you can tap into those, and you can commune with them, interact with them, and gain insights from them. Rather controversial. Many people don't want to admit this kind of stuff. They think it's woo-woo, new age stuff, but it's possible. Don't believe me? Discover for yourself. Actually do it. Go do it. Actually contact a fucking alien and commune with it. Now, of course, understand that if you commune with an alien, you're just communing with yourself. An alien is just a projection of your own mind. It's just one more entity within the mind of God. So, just like a dog and a cat are projections of your own mind. They're imaginary. Your parents are imaginary, and so are aliens. But they do have a relative reality in the same way that we say, like, well, if I own a cat, we can say, I have a cat and my cat exists. Okay, well, what does that really mean? That's a relative distinction that we make, and we say that, yeah, Leo has a cat. Okay. Well, likewise, we can make a relative distinction that you met an alien and you communed with it. Okay. So we can do that. There's a higher truth, though, which is that in the absolute sense, that alien and my cat, they're just all figments of my own imagination. But, you know, we live mostly in the relative domain, so it can be useful to communicate with an alien. Maybe you'll get some good insights about how to overcome your erectile dysfunction, or how to love people more, or how to earn more money, or whatever aliens want to teach you. All right, so that's the list. Of course, this is not a complete list. I'm mostly talking about things that I've personally experienced. Now, this bonus list that I just gave you, a lot of these I have not experienced. For example, I have not tapped into past lives. I have not met aliens. I have not had a total extinction of my perception, but it's very clear to me at this point that this stuff is possible, given everything else that I've experienced. Most of the other stuff that I told you, I have directly personally verified. Not even once, but multiple times. But I'm always open to more. Like I said, this is not a complete list. There could be a lot more that I'm missing still, although I think I've got most of the important ones here. So what you need to understand about this list is that all of these are distinct insights that you can have, direct experiences, things you can become conscious of. You can either have these individually or in aggregate or in clumps. Like you can realize simultaneously oneness and maybe God and maybe what consciousness is. You can get that all in one blast. But also you can get it in 3 separate blasts, where first you realize what God is, then you realize what consciousness is, then you realize oneness, or in whatever order. The orders can all be different. On top of that, there's also degrees of depth. So it's not just that you can realize that you're God. How deeply do you realize that you're God, and how deeply do you understand what God is? There's lots of degrees of depth just to that one facet. And generally that's true for all the different facets. There's degrees of depth to each individual facet. So you can see that we are starting to sort of create like a table or a matrix here of different facets, let's say going horizontally, and then different depths of the facets going vertically. And so at least we have this 2-dimensional matrix, maybe even more. So you can see how quickly this gets very complicated, and we can see how, you know, if we make this table or matrix, we can take an individual teacher or guru or person, and we can sort of check off which of these boxes they have become conscious of. And you can see how most people are probably not going to have a check mark in every single box because it's a big table. There's a lot to realize here and a lot of depth to each realization. And so now we start to see the true complexity of spiritual work and why there's so much confusion and disagreement oftentimes between different teachers and teachings and traditions, because actually they're not all the same. I could shoot a whole video on each one of these facets. And in fact, I have shot long, in-depth videos about what is love, what is intelligence, what is perception, what is truth, what is the absolute, and what is consciousness, and what is duality, what is non-duality, blah, 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 blah. I've shot many of those, and I will do more in the future until I basically exhaust the whole list of these different facets. In this work, it's important to sort of stitch together these individual facets, because sometimes, like, you can have one facet revealed to you today, but then 6 months will pass until you get another facet revealed to you. And then another 6 months will pass and you get another one. So, you know, as the time flows, oftentimes there's months or even years in between different facets. You can get one, but then you kind of forget the other one, you lose it. So you have to come back and sort of stitch them together. It's almost like assembling a giant jigsaw puzzle. Sometimes, you know, you fit together 10 different jigsaw pieces and you get a little piece of the image. You see like, oh, that's a foot. And then you assemble 10 more over here and say, oh, that's an ear. And then you assemble 10 more over here. It's like, oh, that's a tail. But then even if you see that, you still don't know what is the actual animal that you're going to get at the very end. So it's important to stitch it all together so that you can put them all together and say, oh yeah, so that's a foot, that's a tail, that's an ear, that's a nose. Oh, it's a cat. Oh, that's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a giant cosmic cat. And that's sort of what you're doing. each of these insights can be its own epic mindfuck. It can leave you reeling for weeks, for months. It can leave you in denial. It can leave you resisting. It can leave you depressed. It can leave you with an existential crisis while you're coping with it. Your ego is coping with it and struggling to integrate it. It can leave you doubting yourself. Sometimes you can think you've lost your mind by realizing one of these insights. For example, you might get the insight that I'm God. But then, a few days pass and you start to question yourself and you say, well, am I really God or did I just lose my mind two days ago? No, you're really God. It's just that it's such a profound and shocking insight, and it's so contradictory to what society around you has told you and taught you that you can sort of fall back into the beliefs of your society, what your parents and your friends tell you. You tell your mom, hey, I'm God, and she'll tell you, no, you're not. And then who are you going to believe? Well, oftentimes you can get tricked by people outside of you who haven't had these experiences. They can start telling you that you're crazy, that you're losing your mind. Well, actually, they're the crazy ones. Now, of course, it's also possible that you are losing your mind. It's possible to misinterpret these insights and these facets and to some sort of arrange some sort of, twisted, distorted picture, which isn't true to reality, but is some sort of twisted amalgamation of your own ego's projections and shadow. That's also possible. So it's dangerous. You can definitely screw it up. There's no guarantees here. You always have to be careful about self-deception, as I've warned you about in my self-deception 3-part series. But just be aware that you might doubt yourself here, which is why this list is so valuable, because maybe I'm the only person in your life who's actually telling you that you're not losing your mind, and that can be helpful to you. And really, the only people who can help you are those who have gone this deep, but not just this deep, but also this broad, you see? Because what could happen is that you can go to your spiritual guru, you could tell him, hey, I had the realization that I'm God, and your spiritual guru will tell you, no, you're not God, because let's say he was from the Buddhist tradition. And in the Buddhist tradition, they don't talk about God. They prefer to call it nothingness or emptiness. And so when you tell him, I realize that I'm God, and he tells you, no, you're not God, you're nothing, and you haven't realized nothingness yet, you don't realize yet that God and nothingness are actually one, but he doesn't realize it either, your guru, because he hasn't had the insight that he's God. But you as a student, you don't know these subtle distinctions, so you can get tricked by even gurus and teachers that are supposed to be helping you. It's important that you keep in mind that very few spiritual traditions and teachings teach you and explain in clear terms all of these different facets that I've laid out for you here. Many teachings are lopsided and tend to emphasize one facet over other facets. They tend to elevate one facet over other facets. Some teachings will emphasize the God. Other teachings will emphasize the love. Other teachings will just emphasize nothingness or emptiness. Other teachings will emphasize infinity. Other teachings will emphasize who knows what. And why is this? Because usually the people who create these teachings are not super well-rounded mystics. Usually they excel in one or the other. They have a preference for one or the other facet. Many times they haven't even realized half the facets. So they only go with what they got, the best they can do. They're doing the best they can do, but that's not always good enough. Oftentimes they don't know what they're missing. See, it's rare that a teacher realizes all of these facets and integrates them all together in a clear manner and then teaches them all very clearly and explicitly to you. That's quite rare. Some people do it, but it's rare. Because oftentimes people who awake, they awaken through some dogmatic narrow path, like they're a particular sect of Buddhist, or they're a particular adherent to some yogi path. They follow some one particular yogi, and that's all they know. And they have not studied Buddhism, they have not studied Christianity, they have not studied Islam. That's all they know. So when they awaken through only one narrow dogmatic path, that leads them to think that they're fully awake and that they've understood everything there is. But really, they haven't, because they haven't studied all the teachings and they haven't gathered all the different facets. And their tradition probably didn't teach them all the different facets. And they probably weren't good enough at meditation and yoga and whatever else they were doing to gather all the facets independently by themselves, to discover them. Very few people actually discover spirituality independently. Most people just dogmatically walk some sort of path. They do some sort of narrow practice like meditation or prayer or contemplation or self-inquiry, and that's it. But they don't realize that, self-inquiry, it can awaken you, but it can also limit your awakening as well. So be careful assuming that your guru or teacher or teaching or the book you're reading is fully awake, that it's not missing any facets. Because you know what? Even the best teachers, I found that they often will not admit that they're missing a facet. When you confront them about some aspect of their teaching that you think might be lopsided or lacking, usually what you get from them is denial and ridicule and dismissal. They will dismiss your questioning of their teachings and their lopsidedness. They will dismiss it as your own ignorance. See, that's very easy for a guru or a teacher to do, because they start to take it for granted that they have already fully awoken, that there's nothing more for them to learn. Of course, this is just like another form of a sort of spiritual closed-mindedness. They're resting on their laurels. You can go to a teacher and ask them about love. And if that teacher has never experienced love, he'll tell you that love is bullshit, that love is just a human emotion, and that it has nothing to do with awakening. Or you can go to a teacher and ask him about omniscience or about infinite intelligence, and they'll tell you, oh, forget about that. Just go and stop thinking about that and just go ask the question, who am I? See? That's because maybe they haven't realized what infinite intelligence is. And that doesn't mean they're not awake. They can be awake, but they can still not realize all the full nuances of the various facets that I've outlined for you here. And this difference between the different depths and also between the different facets becomes very apparent on psychedelics, which is one of the reasons that psychedelics are such a powerful tool, because different psychedelics allow you to hit awakening from different angles and perspectives, from different states of consciousness. Allows you to have different insights than you normally would be able to do. This is very difficult to do if you're practicing only one narrow meditation technique or self-inquiry technique or some yoga technique. See, it becomes like one-dimensional. It's almost like you're playing a piano, but you've only been taught a few notes on one side of the keyboard. So you're punching these notes here, but you don't even know how to move across to the other notes that you're missing. See? But psychedelics, especially if you're using a broad range of them, different ones like LSD, mushrooms, DMT, 5-MeO, DPT, whatever, MDMA, they can all hit different facets and notes, and then you can see the spectrum, you can see the mountain range that is awakening a lot better. That's one of their benefits. And some psychedelics are better at hitting certain notes than others. For example, MDMA hits that love note really well. 5-MeO DMT hits the God note really well. And it varies. It varies. That's a complex topic for another day. So as you contemplate, as you meditate, as you self-inquire, as you do psychedelics, as you do yoga, whatever your practice is, it can be hard to predict which facet you're going to stumble upon next. It's somewhat random. It depends a lot also on what your intentions are. What do you want to know? What are you genuinely curious about the most? You might wonder, like, well, Leo, let's say I think that I'm missing the facet of absolute love, or I'm missing the facet of infinite intelligence. How do I target that particular one? And Here it's a little bit hit or miss, bit of a trial and error situation. I don't think there's a foolproof way, but if there was one way, I think the most important way would be through your intention. What is it that you genuinely want to know? What does your heart want to know about reality? See, why are you doing this work at all? Why are you questioning? Why are you pursuing this facet of love? Or why are you even interested in this facet of infinite intelligence? You have to really want to know. And for that, it's helpful to have a question that you're latched onto as though your life depends on it. Like, for example, a question like, what am I? Or a question like, what is reality? Or a question like, what is God? Or what is love? Or why does anything exist? Or what is consciousness? Or why am I even here? What is the point of my life? What is the purpose of my life? These sorts of questions channel your mind via intention and will into some particular direction. You see? And it's not enough just to be pursuing one of these insights simply to check off a box. You have to really want to know it. Like there was a time in my life where I really needed to know what reality is. And then I got that desire answered because I cared about it so much. And then once that was answered, then I was like, okay, I'm satisfied with that answer. Now I have a different answer. Now I want to know, like, what is God? And then that desire is satisfied. And then so I get that one and I say, okay, well, now I understand God, but I still don't fully understand, like, why is all of this here? And then I'm questioning that one, and then I get an insight into that one, and then finally I'm like, oh, okay, now I understand why it's all here. And then I'm like, well, but I still don't quite understand what's the connection between love and truth. I'm still murky on that. And so I question that the next time, and then I get an answer to that. And then I'm like, oh, okay, now I understand. Now I realize that love and truth are actually two sides of one coin. Okay, that's clear. But then there's something else I'm confused about. And so this is how it's worked for me. And it probably, I assume, will work for you in a similar way. Questioning is very powerful. In fact, I have no less than 4 episodes for you to watch about questioning. One called The Power of Asking Questions, another one called Contemplation, which teaches you how to contemplate, another one called How to Contemplate Using a Journal, which teaches you contemplation using a journal, and then I have another one, an older one, called The 64 Most Fascinating Questions That a Human Being Can Ask, which teaches you about various kinds of existential questions that might be interesting and meaningful for you, that can spark your curiosity and get you motivated to do this work and to get these questions answered. Don't take questioning for granted. Really high quality questioning is like the backbone of all self-actualization work. And your questions don't have to always be existential. There can also be more minor questions like, should I get married? Should I have children? Or so stuff like that. You can ask questions like that as well. And those can be answered. So you might wonder, Leo, how do I realize all these facets? What's the best way to get them all? Gotta catch them all. Personally, I found psychedelics to be the best way. If you're actually interested in hitting all of these facets, psychedelics are a great tool because you can use different ones to target different facets. You don't get stuck in some one-dimensional technique. They allow you to contemplate and to set intentions at the beginning of each trip. You can record your various insights and piece them together. You can do multiple trips and connect all the dots, and then it becomes like this journey of an ever-expanding panoramic big picture view of what consciousness and what reality is, what God is. Now, of course, people here object and they say, oh, Leo, but what about without psychedelics? I don't want to do psychedelics. Is it possible to get all this stuff without psychedelics? Of course it's possible, but also it's very easy to miss some. it would be wise to use all tools at your disposal. But if you insist on only doing yoga or only doing self-inquiry or only doing meditation, okay, that's an artificial limit that you've set upon yourself. Fine, then work within those limits that you've set upon yourself. Try to do it that way. See how far you can get. You can probably get pretty far if you really want to, and if you're serious about it and you're really curious and you want to check off all the facets, you probably could through yoga or meditation or whatever. But also, at some point, you got to wonder, why are you limiting yourself? If there are other ways. Really, if you're serious about this work, you should not be attached to the method. You should be attached to understanding as a whole. What you want to care about is just understanding of what consciousness is. And then how you get there shouldn't matter to you. Whether you do it through yoga or meditation or psychedelics, who cares? As long as it gets you there. Of course, there are pros and cons to every approach. I'm not saying psychedelics are necessarily the best approach. I'm saying that they're particularly good at hitting a diversity of facets and showing you the broad range, the mountain range of awakening. Yoga might be good for taking you down one very narrow, specific facet, for example, or a cluster of facets. Now you might say, but Leo, this contradicts what you're saying here with Buddhism, or with Hinduism, or with what my guru says. Because they don't talk about all these different facets in the same way that you do. That's right. So part of this contradiction can just be an apparent surface level contradiction, in the sense that, for example, Buddhists might not talk about God, but that doesn't mean they haven't had that insight, although some of them might not have. So it's a little bit tricky here. I might be contradicting what your guru says, or maybe I'm just using different words and I'm just phrasing things differently, and I'm just articulating these facets in a different way. You see, not only are there all these different facets and depths, but we can also talk about them differently. We can use different metaphors, different words, different language. That very much depends on your tradition and on your inclinations and so forth. But also, I would just caution you, don't take for granted that your guru or teacher knows everything that I'm talking about, that they have checked off every box. That's not guaranteed. And that doesn't necessarily diminish the greatness of your guru. For example, your guru might be really, really good in one or two facets or a cluster of facets, but still be missing some other one. See? There can be trade-offs between depth and level of mastery versus breadth. See? So just keep that in mind. After all, how do you know which specific facets your guru has realized? Have you sat down with your guru and asked them to check off this entire matrix of facets? Of course not. Most gurus wouldn't allow you to do that anyways, even if you asked. They would hand wave you away and just tell you to do their technique. They're not going to sit there and argue with you about all these different facets. And for you as a newbie, how are you going to know to discuss these facets with your guru? You won't know. You won't even know which questions to ask them. You won't know whether they're giving you valid, legitimate answers or not. You won't know when they're dismissing your question because it's a bad question or because they're actually ignorant of the answer. Gurus can be sneaky this way. A lot of times they'll ignore a good question and blame you for being ignorant or being too nosy or something like that, when actually they're hiding their own ignorance. It's very difficult to know the degree of understanding that some guru has. And most followers, it never even occurs to them to ask or to question, what does their guru really understand? Few gurus tell you everything they understand. So this means you have to take responsibility. You have to be careful. Don't just make blanket assumptions about people. Don't assume that all awakenings are the same. Don't assume that all gurus are equally enlightened. Don't assume that all paths lead to the same destination in this work. If awakening was simple and binary, there wouldn't be so much disagreement between different schools and teachers and gurus. How do we explain this disagreement? Clearly, these disagreements exist, and they have existed throughout all of human history across all continents. So this can't just be something I'm making up. Clearly, there is a vast variety of spiritual teachings and techniques. What are the chances that every single technique would hit and be equally effective at reaching every insight and every facet that there is? Very little chance that they're all perfectly equal. Chances are that certain techniques hit certain facets better than others. See? Certain teachings are deeper than others. Certain teachings are broader than others. There really isn't one state or one insight that all awakened people reach. That's a mistaken assumption. Which is why it's wise to play various gurus off one another. You can do that. You can actually spot contradictions between gurus this way. Take one great guru from the East, take one great guru from the West, then, read their books, and then take the sayings of this one and direct it at this guy, and take the sayings of this guy and direct it at this guy, and you'll see that there's going to be a conflict between the two. And how do we explain this? Well, I explain it that they have different depths and different facets. That's how I explain it. Beware that partial realizations can be dangerous. For example, you can have partial awakening where you fail to realize love. Absolute love. And then your teachings will lack love. And that will be a problem. Or a shame, really, to have a teaching of awakening without the love component. Or you can teach awakening but still deny God. For example, Sam Harris has some bit of awakening, but not that deep, not that broad. He talks about no self. He's done various kinds of Buddhist meditation for years. Supposedly he's a pretty good meditator and so forth, but he doesn't know what God is. He's not conscious of that. He's in denial about God. And so in this sense, he's misleading his students. That's a great shame, especially because he's God. What is the point of being awake when you don't realize you're God? That's not full awakening. Or for example, you can have various other kinds of teachers who awaken in some way, but their teaching is kind of nihilistic. That's also limited and problematic in my opinion. You can have a partial realization, but then your ego can still hang on, and it can create fear and rejection of this realization that you've had, and then that can spin off into a sort of distorted direction. Or you can have some deep realization and insight, but then you can dismiss other valid teachings from different traditions and different paths. For example, some student comes to you practicing the path of love, but you dismiss them and you tell them to stop because you tell them that love is bullshit and that it's not right, because your path was a path of like hardcore fucking meditation or strong determination sitting, and then you want the student to follow your path without realizing that your path isn't necessarily going to work for her or for him. See? And you might dismiss some yogic technique because it doesn't fit in with your ideas of how to do self-inquiry. Well, self-inquiry is just one way to do it. Yoga is another way to do it. There's a lot of different ways to do yoga. And many more spiritual techniques besides those two. See? So partial realizations lead to these various kinds of conflicts because, yeah, it's partial. From a partial perspective, you misunderstand other perspectives. That's the whole problem with partial perspectives. Another objection that arises is, but Leo, if awakening has all these facets you talk about, doesn't that contradict the most important point, which is the oneness of truth, the oneness of reality? It's a good question, and the answer is no, it doesn't contradict, because actually the distinction between oneness and manyness is itself something that must collapse into a higher, greater absolute oneness, you see? So manyness is not the opposite of oneness. Really, you have to realize they're the same thing, which is why I call them facets. The metaphor in my mind is that of a jewel or a diamond. A diamond is one thing that has many facets. That's exactly how it works. Or the classic, Hindu metaphor of the elephant, the 5 blind men and the elephant. That's what we're talking about here. The elephant is enlightenment or truth, and each blind man is groping a different part. So, what's true? Is the elephant one thing, or is the elephant a collection of things, like a tail, a foot, an ear, a tusk, a trunk, and whatever else it has on it? It's both. See, my hand is one, but it also is 5 fingers. You might say that the fingers are different facets of my hand. I can know each finger individually, or I can know them all together collectively. Each way of knowing is important. It's important to know them all collectively because it would be a problem if I denied that I have a thumb, let's say. See, I would be dysfunctional if I had to deny to myself that I have a thumb. But also it would be a problem if all I knew is my thumb, and I knew it really close, and I knew all the intimate details and wrinkles of my thumb, and all the scars that are on it, but then I didn't use it holistically in sync with all the other fingers of my hand so that I could use it as an actual hand. I would be too preoccupied with the thumb, and then I would be pushing stuff with my thumb all the time, and the only way I'd be interacting with the world is with my thumb, and I would ignore the other possibilities of my hand. You see, that's what's going on here. So what I'm about, what Actualized.org is about, is learning how to use the whole hand holistically, but also taking interest in individual aspects as well, right? So we need to be able to zoom in and zoom out, be sometimes specific and limited, and sometimes holistic and very broad. You might wonder, how many facets are there in total? Is there an infinite number of them? Do they never end? Do we just keep finding new facets all the time? Honestly, I don't know how many facets there are. In a certain sense, it depends on how you split them up. What do you count as a facet? That's relative. So there's not some one absolute number of facets, like there's 35 facets, and that's it. Or there's 52 facets. No, it depends on how you count them. Practically speaking, I would say that there's at least 24 major facets that are important and crucial to your path to realize. And if you don't get this 24 facets, your awakening is not going to be very complete, in my opinion. And then beyond that is sort of extra. Some of the facets are more important than other ones. Some of them are kind of tangential and not so important. I mean, in the end, if you want, you can consider literally every physical object in the universe to be a facet of God, a facet of truth with a capital T. Every one of my fingers is a facet of the absolute, in a sense. But, we don't want to get that granular. We're more interested here in major facets, like, do you understand absolute love? Do you understand what God is? Do you understand that you're God? Do you understand what nothingness is? Do you understand what infinity is? Do you understand what will with a capital W is? Do you understand what truth with a capital T is? If you're missing some of those, you're missing something important, I would say. But don't get hung up on counting them. Now, a warning, even if you get all of the checkboxes here that I'm talking about, and you get all these 30-some facets, that's still not the end of your work. Not even close. you're still missing many other important domains of this work. These facets don't guarantee you, for example, emotional mastery. They don't guarantee that you're going to transcend suffering. They don't guarantee that you transcend your shadow. You still got shadow work to do. They don't guarantee personal development. You got personal development to do. They don't guarantee relationship mastery. You got that to do. Communication mastery, you're missing that. Life purpose, you're missing that. Changing your behaviors and bad habits, that's not guaranteed. Just because you know all these 30-some facets doesn't mean that you have quit all your bad habits and addictions. It doesn't mean that you've dropped all of your limiting beliefs and fallacious beliefs about reality. You might still have some silly conspiracy theory in your mind. You might still believe that your culture, your Hindu culture, is superior to other cultures. You might still believe that psychedelics are evil or whatever. See, that's still possible. You can still hold false beliefs even if you're awake. How about spiral development? Spiral dynamics-wise. Knowing these facets doesn't guarantee that you are now maxed out on your cognitive, moral, interpersonal, or political developmental lines. It doesn't guarantee career development. It doesn't guarantee technical skills. There are technical skills you need to develop in life to be successful. See, so you got all that to work on. And none of the insights that I talked about guarantees a permanent embodiment of that insight. So just because you realize that you are God does not mean that now you live every single day as though you were God. Just because you realize that there's no such thing as evil doesn't now mean that you walk around every day never seeing evil anymore, loving absolutely everything. It doesn't guarantee that. Usually that would take a lot more work to be able to fully embody these profound insights. That's really where the bulk of the work lies in this work. Not realizing the insight, but then fully embodying it. That's the really hard part. So even though I've realized many of these insights, again, don't take me to be greater than I actually am. For example, I still struggle with the notion of death. I would still say that I haven't conquered fully my fear of death, even though I know that death is imaginary. Now you might say, well, but how could that be? Well, because it's a very big thing to embody. It's hard to truly be so conscious all the time that you're immune to threats to your physical survival. That's hard. To embody that will take you probably decades of work or some really profound awakening. See? It's hard to be loving all the time when people are being assholes to you. What can you say? It's hard. This is our work here. See, even though I know that everything is love, that doesn't mean that I'm always in a lovey, chipper mood. And if someone does something nasty or evil to me or devilish, people can still behave like jerks. That doesn't mean that I won't get triggered sometimes. I won't get angry. I won't feel bad about it or whatever. Now, of course, in the bigger picture, I can kind of come back and recenter myself and say, okay, yeah, that guy's an asshole and I should probably love him. And I can see the love, kind of the twisted form of love that he's expressing towards me and how I'm judging him to be evil. Yeah, okay, I can kind of see this, but in the heat of the moment, it's not always that easy. And even with everything I said here, there are still millions of minor insights that you can have. For example, you can realize everything above that I told you, but still you can lack insight into things like, how does science work? What is science? That takes a specific insight. What is evolution? What is art? What is a relationship? What is technology? What is leadership? What is pain? What is motivation? What are thoughts? What is fear? What is anger? What is happiness? How do psychedelics work? What is collective ego? What is devilry? How does society work? What is society? What is culture? What is ideology? And this list is basically endless. You can question reality at this kind of granular level basically till you're dead. Till your body drops dead, at least. And there's a lot of value in answering these sorts of minor questions. I mean, these aren't really minor, they're pretty major. But they're minor relative to the bigger stuff I talked about above. So just kind of start to see that there's a lot to this work. Probably start with the big stuff, then you can move down the food chain to the smaller stuff, depending on how curious you are. You know, many people will probably burn out, and their curiosity will burn out after they get the major stuff, and they probably won't even care about the minor stuff. But personally, I love questioning this minor stuff as well. Like, for example, I'm interested in questions about society and culture and politics and understanding leadership and technology and evolution and science. And these, traditionally, many spiritual teachers would say, oh, all this is just nonsense. But it's not nonsense. In fact, it's these more minor insights that are, in a certain sense, more practical and more useful to helping us to advance and to evolve society and making it better. But of course, those big ones are also very, very important and life transforming. So start with those. Focus on those. As you pursue awakening, be careful not to stop prematurely. Just keep in mind that it's probably deeper and richer than you ever imagined. And ultimately, what we really care about here is how deeply do you understand reality? At the ultimate level, how deeply do you understand it? How conscious are you of it? And that determines how well you're also able to embody it. So when you're not able to embody it fully, that probably means that you're not conscious of it fully and that you don't understand it fully. My notion of understanding is a very deep and profound notion. So there you go. Now you have your list. Now you have your work cut out for you. Go and see how much of this you can realize for yourself. Don't believe me. For all you know, I'm wrong. For all you know, I'm lying. For all you know, I'm deluded. How would you know? You don't know. The only way you'll know if the things I'm telling you are true is by doing it and having these insights for yourself. See how many of them you can validate. And then you'll be able to know how right or how wrong I was. There you go. All right, I'm done here. Please click that like button for me. And now I got to tell you a little bit about Patreon. Go check out Patreon at patreon.com/actualized, or click the link down below where you can do a little donation action, and come check out Actualized.org. There you will find exclusive content, stuff I post on my blog, new insights, new videos, vlogs that I'm releasing on a weekly basis. Check out the forum, check out the Life Purpose course, check out the book list, and I'll be doing more courses in the future. So check back periodically, because you never know really when I'll release some new course or some new resource that could potentially change your whole life. As far as the Patreon thing goes, I'm excited to see where it goes. I'm grateful for your support. But also, I want to warn you that I want to leave open the possibility that in the future, you know, I do this kind of work, but it's hard for me, the deeper I go in this existential work, it's harder for me to know what my future plans are. Like, it's hard for me to know where I'll be in 5 years or 10 years, whether I'll even be doing this work, whether I'll be passionate about it, whether I'll outgrow it, or I'll come up with some new, better idea or whatever. So I want to leave the possibility open that I might just like renounce life and become a monk and just disconnect from business, disconnect from society, disconnect from teaching, disconnect from running a giant organization and this sort of stuff. So right now I am somewhat committed to building Actualized.org and to growing it and to releasing a lot more content, writing some books and so forth, making some more courses. So that's sort of my medium-term plan over the next few years, maybe doing some tours and workshops and so forth. I am excited about those possibilities. But also I feel deep down that there is sort of a deeper calling for me ultimately. And at some point I might have to take some time away from doing this work because it does take a lot of my time and mental energy to do all this activity and just like go deeper into myself, retreat deeper into myself, maybe do some month-long retreats or even year-long retreats where I don't talk to anybody, where I don't produce any kind of work, where I just work on embodying these various facets that I talked about here within myself, with the ultimate aim of then coming back and then doing the work I've been doing, but at a next level, at a much deeper level. So just keep in mind that that possibility is out there. If I decide to do that for a long time, like if I'm going to take a year off or even more, I might cancel the Patreon entirely, for example. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. Because part of the thing with the Patreon donations now is that I sort of feel like, well, if you guys are donating to me, then I kind of feel even more obligated to like release weekly content and make it good. Because you guys are supporting me. And that's good. It motivates me. But also, I don't want to be totally beholden to that. In the end, to me, the most important thing is taking my own awakening as deep as possible. Because what I know is that the deeper I can awaken, the more loving I can become, the better I can embody it, the more powerful I become as a human and ultimately as a leader and as a teacher. And then the more I embody it, the less I have to speak about it, the less I have to be analytical with my teachings, the more I can just walk down the street and influence people just with my presence. And that's ultimately where this is probably going. I'm just not sure exactly how all of that will play out. So be flexible with me here. Let's just see where it goes and how this evolves, because we're doing something new. I'm sort of documenting my whole spiritual journey on video here along with you. I mean, I'm like teaching you, but at the same time, I'm learning myself every single week. So I'm not coming at you from some high position on a mountaintop. Really, I'm sort of coming at it from a lower place where you get to see me grow along with you in this journey. And, there's pros and cons to doing it that way. So let's just see how it goes. Hopefully it's more relatable to you and you kind of see me struggling and suffering through this journey, and then you can relate with that. And then that inspires you and motivates you and makes this whole process look a little bit more human and down to earth for you, and makes you feel like you can do it too. Like, hey, if he's struggling through it and he can do it, then maybe so can I. So stick around, stay tuned, and you'll see more of that to come.